Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Julia Kim. Here's what's coming up on the programme. Iraqis celebrate the second anniversary of the October 2019 protest movement. We'll have a report from our correspondent on the ground coming up in the show. Also on the programme, as countries count down to the COP26 Global Climate Summit, we'll talk about the challenges and criticisms facing the region today with the co-founder of the Arab Youth Climate Movement, Qatar. And the first art exhibition at the Pyramids of Giza take place for the first time in their 4,500-year-old history. But first, this Monday, Iraqis celebrated the second anniversary of the 2019 protest movement. It began on October 1st, but stopped for a period following a brutal crackdown by authorities on protesters. They resumed again on October 25th, lasting for months. In Baghdad and in Iraq's southern cities, hundreds gathered to pay homage to those killed during the protests. Jean-Emile Jamin and our correspondent in Baghdad, Lucille Wesserman, report.
Their heart-rending speeches follow one after another, marking the second anniversary of the revolt. In their hands, the demonstrators hold the portraits of those killed during or after the movement. Ehab al-Wazni is one of the most well-known names. He was murdered last May. His brother travelled from Kerbala to pay his respects.
احنا قبلنا دعاوى على اشخاص هم متهمين بقتل اخي الشهيد ولكن الحكومه لم تستجب وهذا الدافع او اي شيء هو الاستمرار ثوره تشرين العظيمه للقضاء على هؤلاء الفاسدين القتل والميليشيات.
2 weeks after parliamentary elections in the country, these Iraqis are waiting for the new lawmakers to take office, hopeful that their pleas will now be heard.
فصعدوا مجموعة بسيطة جدا من التشرينيين اللي هم كانوا متواجدين بالثورات أو موالين يعني للبرنامج اللي إحنا نطالب به. لذلك عندنا نوعا ما أمل وإن شاء الله ما يخيبون أملنا اللي صعدوا وخصوصا من الناصرية.
Despite the importance of the date, the former revolutionaries are happy to celebrate in quieter surroundings, far from the epicenter of the movement in Tahrir Square.
There's anger over Israel's plans to advance the construction of thousands of new settlement homes in the occupied West Bank. Palestinians have slammed the move, as have Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's left-wing coalition partners, the Labour and Meretz parties. On Sunday, Israel announced tenders for over 1,300 housing units, one of the final stages before construction can begin. Now, that's in addition to some 3,000 additional settler homes, a move that's already drawn calls for restraint from the United States. Well, these settlements are considered illegal under international law. The COP26 Global Climate Summit gets underway this Sunday in Glasgow, and ahead of the event, the world's top oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, has launched a Middle East Green Initiative. It's aimed at funding projects to reduce regional carbon emissions. Currently, the Middle East is warming at twice the global average. It's overtaken the European Union in greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists say that if nothing changes, the region could be too hot to sustain human life by the end of the century. Well, for more on this, we can speak to Neeshad Shafi, the co-founder of the Arab Youth Climate Movement, Qatar. He joins us now from Doha. Neeshad, thank you very much for joining us today. What are the most pressing climate challenges facing the Middle East, and what needs to happen to deal with them?
Thank you, Gillian, for having me. One of the points you already mentioned is the temperature rise. Unlike rest of the world, the Middle East would have extensive heating, that's 2 degrees than the rest of the world, as per the current 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. The serious concern areas would be water shortages and sea level rise. These are the main concern areas for this region as a whole, given the fact the Gulf of the Middle East have been quite having a different ecosystem as the rest of the world because it is a desert ecosystem and its temperature rises, warms at a faster rate.
We've also seen the response differ wildly between the rich countries and the poorer countries. How have their response differed in the face of, very similar challenges?
The Gulf countries, who are oil and gas rich countries, have extensive sovereign wealth, which have been, of course, used in research and development and also on technologies that can at the same time bring, help them to mitigate those issues of climate change. For example, water scarcity has been extensively taken care through desalination, unlike the poor countries who doesn't have that capacity. They have to look at the conventional way of treating water, etc. So there is a huge gap between the rich and the poor countries when in terms when you're coming to climate adaptation or mitigation, or how even they take climate action.
Right. And what is the public messaging about these issues like, especially in these wealthier countries? Because there's a lot of water wastage, for example, in these richer Gulf nations where the water is subsidized. So ordinary citizens don't really have much of an incentive to save water. What can be done about that?
Well, I mean, that's what Arab Youth Climate Movement Qatar does. We were lately working on a carbon footprint app where to let the community knows that even if you get the luxury of, subsidized water and electricity, you need to understand what is your carbon footprint on the environment and how much you impact the environment. Yes, we know the larger elephant in the rooms are the oil and gas industries, but you as an individual, what you can be done. So at the larger context, people are not very much aware beyond the cliches of, climate change, sustainability. They haven't a great knowledge what exactly is at stake. At the same time, we as an organization is trying to look at the grassroots level of understanding those issues to bring to community an awareness that it's a larger issues, but it can be brought down to a smaller cost of our own country and see what you are doing and what our country could be doing at a collective action at a very grassroots level.
Now, Qatar is the top exporter of liquefied natural gas, and it's planning to boost production, yet emissions from liquefied natural gas are expected to hit 22% of global carbon emissions. I mean, obviously, it's not just Qatar that's facing similar issues. I mean, how do you address these claims of hypocrisy from some climate activists?
I mean, the fact is most of the latest announcement of net zero are super welcoming. Unlike in the past, these countries weren't very keen to address climate change in terms of emission reduction or any providing technological solution. I mean, net zero would have been a dream like a couple of weeks back to most of the experts like us in the region. It has been overwhelmingly important to also understand having that sort of scenarios or mindset is quite a welcoming move. But of course, like you mentioned, are they going to do enough to make sure that is done in the right way? For example, the net zero, what they have been announced, it's only for the production that goes out of the country or only for the local consumption. They are not taking care of what is going out or what are the produced oil which is going to the global market. So that disparity is like, whatever we use, we are going to make sure it reaches to net zero by whatever 2050 for Saudi Arabia, 2060 for UAE, or 2060 for Bahrain. Of course, at the moment, Qatar has not made any net zero announcement, but also there have been a report on Bloomberg recently that Qatar was against vague announcement of net zero as such, telling that it's not an easy path to achieve for most of the oil and gas countries. So I think at the same time, you have to be careful that the country's economy has to go and prosper at the same time, making sure that your global commitments are met in line with the Paris Agreement.
Now, I just wanted to ask you about these protests, these Fridays for Future protests that aren't really an option in the Gulf nations. And consequently, youth climate activists in the region don't get as much publicity as those in the West. How do they feel about this lack of visibility and what are they trying to do on the ground?
What happened right now is the whole climate movement is hijacked by the global north or the super, or what I call is like the whitewashed youth movement. I always request, as the young people from the Middle East, we don't want any representative. We should be represented by ourselves. We don't need somebody shouting for us. We know our requirement. Our requirements is not what they're looking at too. Our aspirations are different. Our requirement for our respective government is also quite different from theirs. So in order to have a collective global youth voices at the international climate negotiation, we need to make sure the young people from the Arab region are given the right platform. We need to make sure Arab youth are also part of this global discussion.
Okay, Neeshad Shafi, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for being with us here on Middle East Matters.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian.
Well, moving on now, Egypt's state of emergency will be lifted for the first time since April 2017. The announcement was made in a Facebook post by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Egypt imposed a state of emergency after deadly bombings of churches and had routinely extended it at 3-month intervals. It granted authorities sweeping powers to make arrests and crack down on political dissent. Now, Egypt's famed Giza pyramids are the backdrop of a new contemporary art exhibition. The Forever Is Now exhibit is the first of its kind in the 4,500-year-old history of the pyramids. It showcases the works of 10 Egyptian and international artists.
It's one of the 7 world wonders. And this year, the ancient meets the modern at the Giza Pyramid Complex, where 10 artists were invited to create works inspired by Egyptian civilization.
For every artist working in Giza Plateau, it's very important point of the life. I take 2 boat between this clock, and when the boat turn, sand start to come and give us our time, short time for people.
Like Alexander Ponomarev, several of the artists use ancient Egyptian iconography for inspiration. Moataz Nasser, originally from Alexandria, depicted a traditional wooden sailboat transporting the souls of the pharaohs to the heavens. Others, like French artist JT, experimented with optical illusions. His giant postcard shows a hand holding the top of a disconnected Khafre pyramid.
And I think this place constantly questions us on our place on Earth and our civilization and what was left behind and what we're leaving after us. So this leaving a mark, which I started with graffiti, which is about leaving a mark on a building, this is at the level of humanity.
At sunset, the pieces are lit up under the watchful eye of Ada, the world's first robot artist invented by British designer Aidan Miller. She turns the images captured by the camera in her eyes into her own works of art.
And finally, a heartbreaking photo of a Syrian father and son has won the top prize at the Siena International Photo Awards. Titled Hardship of Life, the photo from Turkish photographer Mehmet Aslan shows a Syrian refugee who lost his leg during a bombing in Idlib. He's holding up his son, who was born without limbs. The family now live in southern Turkey, where they've been trying to obtain prosthetics for their son. Aslan says he hopes the photo will help them do so, as well as ease the backlash against refugee communities in Turkey. Well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of Middle East Matters. Thanks for joining us. Stay with us. There's more world news coming up here on France 24.
In the United States, Democrats and Republicans are at loggerheads over the issue of migration.
We saw that in 2014 under Obama. We saw that in 2019 under Trump, and now we're seeing this under Biden.
Biden's election gave thousands of immigrants fresh hope after Trump's threats to build a wall. They risk their lives every day.
El viaje fuerte, muy fuerte. Nosotros tenemos una semana en esto.
Now there's people fleeing their countries, so they're looking for a better way of life in the United States.
Immigration, the challenge facing Biden. Watch reporters on France 24 and France24.com.